The pervasive acrid smell of decaying vegetation and damp earth still clings to me, a phantom odor that refuses to be scrubbed from my senses. It's as if the very essence of that cursed mountain in Madagascar has burrowed deep into my nasal passages, a constant, unwelcome reminder of the horrors I witnessed, the sounds I endured, and the losses I suffered on that ill-fated expedition. I went there searching for lemurs, those enchanting, elusive primates that weave through the canopies of the ancient forests, their lives often veiled in mystery. I was, at my core, a biologist, a humble explorer of life's intricate enigmas. Little did I anticipate that, instead of those vibrant, leaping creatures, I would stumble upon something infinitely more terrifying, something that defied all logical explanation. My name is Thomas Ashton, and the allure of the uncharted has always held me captive. Madagascar, with its breathtaking biodiversity and landscapes that seemed to have been plucked straight from a surrealist painting, was a haven for someone like me. The Saratanana Massif, the island's highest point, was the focal point of my expedition. I wasn't venturing alone into this wilderness. I was accompanied by two individuals. Jacques, my local guide, a man whose taciturn nature was only surpassed by his profound knowledge of the forest, and Sarah, my intrepid videographer, a young woman with an indomitable spirit and an uncanny ability to capture the raw beauty of the natural world through the lens of her camera. Our objective was simple on paper but ambitious in practice: to catalog and document rare lemur species, a mission that each of us viewed as the ultimate adventure. The first few days were nothing short of spectacular. We encountered various lemur species, their soft fur and inquisitive eyes captivating us with their unique charm. Sarah's camera tirelessly documented every leap and bound, while I meticulously took notes and collected biological samples, my mind buzzing with excitement. Jacques, with his keen intuition and seasoned experience, guided us through the labyrinth of dense vegetation, effortlessly deciphering the subtle signs and whispers of the forest. The jungle was a symphony of sounds and a kaleidoscope of colors, a magnificent spectacle of nature's untamed artistry. However, as time wore on, that initial euphoria gradually gave way to an unsettling unease, a peculiar silence that descended upon the air like a shroud one particularly sweltering afternoon. While delving deeper into a more secluded area of the mountain, we stumbled upon something utterly inexplicable. The vegetation, which should have been haphazardly arranged in the usual chaotic order of nature, was instead laid out in perfect geometric patterns. Circles, squares, and triangles were carved out of the dense forest floor with an unnatural precision. The plants, instead of reaching towards the light in the usual random manner, followed sharply defined lines and angles, as if an invisible geometer had meticulously arranged each and every single leaf, stalk, and tendril. The silence that surrounded us there was even more profound, an oppressive weight as if nature itself had paused, holding its breath in silent reverence of this inexplicable, unnatural order. Jacques appeared visibly agitated, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief, his body rigid with tension. "This place is off limits," he whispered, his voice trembling like a leaf caught in a storm. "The village elders say that it is an ancient landing site for the visitors from the stars. They believe the plants move during the night, forming new patterns as if they are transmitting messages across vast, unimaginable distances. No one in their right mind has ever dared to spend a night in this place." Sarah, ever the curious documentarian, immediately raised her camera, ready to capture the unsettling spectacle. I, the rational scientist who clung to the reassuringly familiar concept of cause and effect, felt an icy dread creep down my spine. This was not, I knew with a certainty that defied all scientific reasoning, natural. However, I, the man of science, the explorer of the unknown, knew that this was something I had to investigate, something that I could not, in good conscience, walk away from. Night descended rapidly, draping the mountainside in a thick, inky darkness, punctuated only by the faint glow of our campfire, which now seemed woefully inadequate against the vast, encroaching night. The cold became palpable, sinking into our bones with an almost tangible weight. We set up our camp in an area that was slightly removed from the anomalous patterns, but we were still within clear visual range of the strange geometric vegetation. Jacques lit the fire, his gaze fixed on the flickering flames, as if seeking answers from the dancing light. Sarah, ever diligent, continued to film, seemingly entranced by the ominous, otherworldly display. I, with my notepad and pen, tried to decipher the strange events, desperately searching for a logical, rational explanation, one that would make the world make sense once again. The silence of the night was broken only by the crackling of the fire and the distant, unsettling howls of unseen nocturnal animals. The tension in the air was almost a physical entity, a heavy, oppressive force that seemed to bind us, a palpable sensation that we were not alone, that something or someone was watching us from the shadows for a fleeting, terrifying moment. I distinctly felt as if the vegetation was moving, that the geometrical patterns were rearranging themselves, shifting and transforming before my very eyes. My gaze darted to Sarah, and I noticed that a strange, unnerving smile had stretched across her face, her eyes fixated on the strange patterns as she moved towards it slowly, as if being drawn by an unseen force. It must be my tired eyes, I thought to myself, desperately trying to rationalize the situation, whilst the plants started to writhe and twist, shifting their positions as if defying my reasoning, mocking my pathetic attempt to make sense of the senseless. I felt, deep within my very soul, the chilling realization that we were not the sole occupants of this remote mountain, that there was something profoundly wrong with this place, and even worse, that we were intruders in a sanctuary that was never meant to be seen by human eyes. Ignoring that premonition, the persistent, urgent voice that urged me to run, to flee the inescapable horror, would be, without a doubt, the single greatest error of my life. Without warning, a strange, unnerving sound tore through the oppressive silence. It was a deep, resonant hum, a low-frequency vibration that seemed to pierce our bones, a sound that seemed to emanate not from the air, but from the very core of the mountain. The flames of the campfire flickered violently, casting dancing, ominous shadows, and the air grew heavy, as if we were all trapped inside some sort of invisible bubble. Jacques, his face ashen, looked at me with absolute, unadulterated terror. In his eyes, "They have returned," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Sarah, however, did not react with fear. She continued to walk towards the vegetation as if a puppet on a string, completely and utterly enraptured by the dance that was unfolding before her eyes. Then I looked back and saw that the plants were no longer still. Each leaf, each branch, each tendril began to shift, like the cogs of some gigantic, otherworldly machine. I realized that those were no longer plants, but something else, something terrifying and unknown. I felt myself being swallowed by a vortex of terror. Sarah had her gaze fixed on the plants, the smile never fading, and Jacques was beside himself, trembling with terror, trying to pull us from the edge of the abyss. I could never have guessed what I was about to see in that terrible night. The hum, the dance of the plants, the fear that was now part of my very existence, all of that was just a prologue to the horrors that were to come, a one-way ticket to the depths of madness and the jaws of death. The fear that had been a distant, nagging unease transformed into a ravenous monster, encircling me, calling to me, devouring me piece by piece. My heart was racing as the dread consumed my very soul. The flickering firelight cast dancing shadows on the trees, each one a grotesque imitation of the geometric patterns that now dominated my thoughts. We were surrounded by an unnatural order, an unsettling contrast to the wild, chaotic beauty of the Madagascar forest. The hum had subsided for now, but its chilling resonance still echoed in my ears, a constant reminder of the inexplicable forces at play. It was in those moments, staring into the flames, that I began to truly understand the gravity of our situation and the complexities of the individuals I was trapped with. Jacques, my guide, had always been an enigma. His knowledge of the forest was unparalleled. His ability to navigate through the thickest vegetation, as if he were a part of it, was something I had always admired. But I saw him now, his usual stoicism replaced by a raw, undisguised fear. He had always been a man of few words, but now he was practically silent, his eyes constantly darting around as if expecting some unspeakable horror to emerge from the darkness. It was an odd contradiction. This man who could track a rare lemur by a single footprint, now reduced to a trembling mess by something he couldn't comprehend. He had always seemed so confident, so sure of his place in this world, but now he was a shadow of his former self. He was always the man who seemed to know the secrets of the forest, but now he looked more lost than I was. I learned that Jacques was a descendant of a lineage of forest guardians, a tribe whose traditions stretched back centuries. They had always lived in harmony with the land, respecting its mysteries, honoring the spirits that they believed resided within the trees, the rocks, and the very air. He told me, his voice trembling, stories passed down through generations, legends, of beings that fell from the stars, beings that could manipulate nature, that could twist and shape the world to their will. His fear wasn't just born out of the present moment. It was steeped in the ancient beliefs of his people, a fear passed down through generations, a fear that had never been faced and always remained, hidden in the darkness of legends. Sarah, on the other hand, was a different kind of mystery. She was always so enthusiastic, so eager to capture the world through her lens. She seemed fearless, always ready to face any challenge with a smile and a witty remark. But now her enthusiasm had morphed into something unsettling. She wasn't scared. She was captivated, her eyes fixated on the patterns, as if she were a moth drawn to an eerie, otherworldly flame. She was always the one who wanted to be in front of the camera, directing and capturing every moment, but now she was silent, a spectator to the unfolding horror. It was an uncomfortable contrast to her usual self, a subtle shift that made me question who she truly was, and what was she seeking. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was seeing something we weren't, that she was resonating with something in those patterns that was beyond our comprehension. Her usual light-hearted demeanor seemed to have vanished, replaced by an eerie stillness. Was she under some sort of spell? Or was there a part of her that had always been drawn to the unknown? A part of her that was waiting for something like this to happen? I knew that Sarah had always been interested in the spiritual side of the world, a side of life that I had always ignored. But now I started to believe that she knew something about the world of mysteries that I could never understand. And this made my sense of dread even deeper. As for myself, I was a man of science, my world built on logic and reason. I had always prided myself on my rationality, my ability to analyze and understand the world around me. But now I was faced with something that defied all scientific explanation. I was surrounded by events that challenged my perception of reality, by concepts that I struggled to grasp. I had always believed that the universe was governed by natural laws, that everything could be explained. But now I was forced to confront the possibility that there were forces at play beyond human comprehension. And that was one of the most terrifying things to face for a scientist like me. I had always seen myself as a fearless explorer, a man who could face any challenge. But now I was questioning my courage, my resilience, and my sanity. Was I truly ready to face the implications of our discovery? Was I truly willing to confront the unknown, even if it meant facing something that could shatter my very understanding of the world. This expedition, which I had envisioned as an opportunity to broaden my knowledge and enrich my understanding of the world, had turned into a terrifying odyssey. A descent into the heart of an inexplicable and terrifying mystery, the stories that Jacques had told me about the visitors from the stars, the ancient traditions of his people, the bizarre behavior of Sarah, the impossible patterns of the vegetation. All of it hinted at a reality far more complex and terrifying than I had ever imagined. As I looked at the dancing shadows around our camp, I felt a chilling realization descend upon me. This was no longer just about lemurs. This was about something much bigger, something ancient, something otherworldly, something that had been hidden for eons. Perhaps, I pondered, everything we had done, everything we had achieved in the pursuit of science and knowledge was nothing more than a drop in the vast ocean of the unknown. Perhaps there were forces at play that were far beyond our comprehension, forces that had been here long before us and would be here long after we were gone. The plants themselves seemed to be alive, dancing as if communicating with something unseen, as if they were part of this ancient ritual that had been going on since the dawn of time. And we were intruders, unwelcome observers of a cosmic event that was not meant for human eyes. We were in a place that we never should have come. And now we were facing the consequences of our hubris. I wanted to believe that I could understand what was going on, but I was now beginning to realize that some things were beyond human comprehension. Perhaps all of this was about survival. Maybe the universe is not always so nice, and maybe we are not supposed to live forever. The universe is a cruel and unforgiving place, and I was now starting to see how cruel and unforgiving the universe could be, and how little the existence of men meant. And I was scared. I was very scared. The night air grew colder, the silence more oppressive. The hum, which had briefly subsided, returned, stronger now, a palpable vibration that resonated deep within my bones. The dancing shadows seemed to take on a life of their own, mimicking the geometric patterns of the vegetation, as if the very fabric of reality were unraveling before our eyes. We were trapped, surrounded by the unknown, and I was beginning to realize that our choices had become a matter of life and death. Jacques, his eyes wide with terror, grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "We must leave," he hissed, his voice barely a whisper. "We must get out of here now, before it is too late." His fear was contagious. It seeped into my veins, igniting a primal instinct to flee. But I couldn't just run. I was a scientist, and I had a responsibility to understand what was happening. I also had a responsibility towards Sarah, who seemed to be in some kind of trance, her eyes fixated on the strange dance of the vegetation, moving towards the center, as if willingly. Walking to her own demise, my mind raced. Should I heed Jacques' warning and flee, leaving Sarah behind to her strange fate? Could I live with myself if I abandoned her? Or should I try to understand what was happening, even if it meant risking our lives? It was a moral dilemma, and I was torn between my scientific curiosity, my sense of responsibility, and my instinct for self-preservation. The dilemma felt like a physical burden, a heavy weight on my shoulders that was crushing me. I was caught between my rational desire to understand the phenomena and the primal urge to escape the horror that surrounded me. This decision was probably going to determine my destiny. While I was grappling with my internal conflict, Sarah suddenly began to move with unnatural grace, as if she were guided by an unseen force. She walked towards the center of the geometric patterns, her movements fluid, almost hypnotic, as if she was part of their strange choreography. She started to mimic the dance of the plants, her arms and legs moving with a precision that was unnerving. "Sarah, stop!" I shouted, my voice trembling. But she didn't respond, She didn't even seem to hear me. She was completely lost too. Whatever spell those patterns were weaving. I moved to grab her, but Jacques held me back. "No, don't go near her," he cried, his voice frantic. "They've taken her. She is not herself anymore." It was then that I noticed the subtle changes that had been happening in the patterns of the plants. They had begun to glow with a faint, ethereal light, pulsating as if they were breathing. They were no longer just static arrangements. They were living, shifting and growing, almost like a sentient being with a will of its own. It was then that I noticed the patterns changing. The circles and squares and triangles were rearranging themselves, as if the plants were trying to communicate with me. My scientific curiosity was now mixed with a growing sense of dread. I felt like I was witnessing something truly extraordinary, something both beautiful and terrifying, and I knew, deep down, that we were not supposed to be a part of it, ignoring. "Jacques, please," and feeling I was running out of time to try and save Sarah, I approached her cautiously. As I got closer, I noticed that the faint light emanating from the plants seemed to grow stronger, and I could feel a strange pull, as if I were being drawn into the patterns myself. It was then that a sudden realization struck me, a horrific and gut-wrenching epiphany. It wasn't just the plants that were moving. They were acting as a conduit, a medium, a transmitter of a signal to something beyond this world. And Sarah was not simply a spectator. She was the receiver. This realization was a turning point. We weren't just observing some strange phenomenon. We were part of an elaborate cosmic ritual. And Sarah, with her fascination for the spiritual and the unknown, had been chosen, or perhaps had volunteered, to be a participant. It was then that I noticed the look on her face. It wasn't a look of fear. It was a look of understanding, a look of serenity, as if she was finally discovering the meaning of life. And it was that look that made my heart sink. She wasn't afraid. She was embracing the unknown. The conflict within me deepened. I had to make a choice. Did I follow Jacques and save myself, leaving Sarah to her fate? Or did I try to rescue her, even if it meant facing the unknown and the very real possibility of death? I was torn between the desire to survive and the need to protect. But that wasn't the only conflict. It was also a conflict between my scientific reasoning and the reality of the supernatural. I still couldn't understand what was happening. I didn't have any logical answer, but I knew I had to do something. The time was running out, and whatever had Sarah had her in an iron grip. And with every passing second, she was drifting more and more. Jacques, sensing my hesitation, tried to drag me away, but I resisted, my gaze fixed on Sarah. Suddenly, one of the plants wrapped a tendril round her leg. It wasn't a natural movement. It was too fast, too deliberate. I could see that it wasn't just a plant anymore. It was something else. It was a part of this strange alien consciousness, and it had Sarah firmly in its grasp. It was a horror that I could not have imagined, but it was real, and it was in front of my very eyes. The reality was that Sarah was lost, and I knew that I had to do something. But what? The tendril wrapped around Sarah's leg tightened, and she began to float towards the center of the geometric patterns, her movements eerily graceful, like a puppet on a string. I felt a surge of adrenaline, a desperate need to do something, too. Save her from whatever fate awaited her within those glowing patterns. But I was also acutely aware that time was slipping away, and my chances of saving her were dwindling with every second. As I watched Sarah, a memory surfaced, unbidden and vivid, like a scene from a forgotten movie reel. I remembered my grandfather, a man of science and reason, just like me, telling me stories of his own expeditions, stories of unexplained phenomena, stories of places where the laws of physics seemed to bend and break. He had always been a rational man, but he had also always harbored a fascination for the unknown. I remembered him telling me, his eyes wide with a mix of awe and trepidation, about the thin places in the world, places where the veil between realities was thinner places, where the boundaries between the natural and the supernatural blurred. And he had always warned me, with an unnerving seriousness, about seeking out things that were better left undisturbed. His words echoed in my mind now, a haunting reminder of the path I had chosen. I realized that I had not listened to his advice. I had been so consumed by my scientific curiosity that I had overlooked the possibility that there were things that were not meant to be explored, that there were some questions better left unanswered. Maybe my grandfather knew something about this place, something that he had never told me. It was a thought that was as unnerving as it was enlightening. He had explored the world, but he had respected what he did not understand. Maybe it was something I should have done too. This was more than just a scientific discovery. This was an ancient mystery, a power beyond human comprehension. Perhaps we were never meant to understand what was happening here, and perhaps it was better if we didn't. Meanwhile, Jacques was tugging on my arm, his voice desperate. "She's gone, Thomas," he cried, his face pale and wet with tears. "You can't save her. We must run now. This place is evil. It will consume us all." His desperation was palpable, and I realized that he wasn't just fearing for himself. He was also fearing for me. Despite his fear, he had stayed by my side. It was a subtle but important change in our relationship. Before, he was just the guide. Now, we were in the same boat, facing the same unknown. It was a terrifying thought, but for the first time. Since this nightmare began, I did not feel alone, but I wasn't just concerned about Sarah's safety. I was also afraid for my own. I realized that I had been so focused on the mystery of the vegetation and on Sarah's strange behavior that I had failed to consider the possibility that I could become part of the ritual myself. Maybe I had been chosen for a reason. Maybe there was a hidden purpose behind my presence here. And if that was the case, it would explain my grandfather's stories about the thin places. He had not told me, but I felt he was trying to warn me of things like this happening. Perhaps I was supposed to be here, and that was why all this was happening, and the tension between Jacques and me changed too. Before, I was the scientist, the leader, the one with all the answers. But now, I had become the one who was making mistakes and decisions that were putting our lives in danger. And Jacques was the one that was urging me to do the right thing. He was also a man of science, but in a different way. His science was based on tradition and lore, and he seemed to know more than I ever could about the spiritual. It was an interesting twist on our relationship. We had traded places, and now I had to rely on him. I glanced at my watch. Time was running out. The sun was starting to rise, and I knew that whatever was happening, it would reach its climax soon. The patterns of the vegetation were glowing with an even brighter light, and the hum was becoming almost unbearable. Sarah had reached the center of the pattern now, and she looked completely serene, as if she had found some kind of peace. The scene was both terrifying and mesmerizing, a macabre spectacle that held me captive. It was like I was watching the final act of a play, a terrifying tragedy that I could do nothing to stop. I was in a race against time. I had to decide what to do, and I had to decide quickly. And as I saw Sarah floating in that light, and Jacques looking at me, I finally realized that I had to save them both, or die trying. My decision was made. I knew that I would not abandon them, and I knew I could not just sit there and watch. I was a man of science, yes, but I was also a human being. And I knew that the time for observation had passed. It was the time for action. And I knew I had to do it before it was too late for all of us. I was going to face the darkness and I was going to do everything that I could to save both Sarah and Jacques, even if it meant facing a creature I was not even sure that existed. The first rays of dawn began to pierce through the canopy, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to writhe and twist like living things. The geometric patterns of the vegetation were glowing with an unnatural intensity now, pulsing like a heart, and the hum had reached a crescendo, a deafening vibration that felt like it was tearing the very fabric of reality around us. Sarah was floating in the center of the patterns, her eyes closed, her face serene. She seemed completely detached from the chaos that surrounded her, as if she had transcended this earthly realm. I knew I had to act, and I had to act fast. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the frantic beating of my heart, and began to move towards Sarah. But as I took my first step, the ground beneath my feet began to tremble. It wasn't an earthquake, it was something else, something far more unsettling. The plants seemed to be alive now, their tendrils reaching out like grasping fingers. The very air itself seemed to vibrate with an invisible force. It was as if the mountain itself was awakening, as if the very earth was a living, sentient entity responding to the strange ritual that was unfolding. I looked at Jacques, and he was backing away, his eyes wide with pure terror. He was shaking his head, murmuring something in his native tongue, but I couldn't hear him above the overwhelming hum. He seemed to be giving up hope, retreating into his ancient fears, leaving me alone to confront this horror. But in that moment, I realized that I wasn't alone. I had the knowledge that I had gained through my scientific studies, and I had the willpower to face anything. And then I saw it. A large dark shape was forming above the glowing patterns. It was unlike anything I had ever seen. It was formless. And yet, it had a very distinct shape, like a living shadow. The plants were no longer moving in a random pattern. They were all moving to the rhythm of this being, which I was now finally seeing for the first time. The air grew heavy. The smell of decaying vegetation became overpowering, and a sense of dread, unlike anything I had ever experienced, washed over me. I was in the presence of something ancient, something powerful, something truly alien, and something that was watching us. As the shadow grew larger, the plants around Sarah seemed to change as well. Their leaves sharpened, their tendrils thickened, turning into a series of sharp thorns, and their light turned from a warm, ethereal glow to a menacing red, as if they were preparing to ensnare her. I knew, with a chilling certainty, that whatever this being was, it was not benevolent, it was not friendly, it was something that was going to consume us all. It was a chilling and undeniable confirmation of Jacques' ancient legends, and a terrifying revelation of the true nature of what was happening here. Then, the unexpected happened. Sarah opened her eyes, and they were no longer the eyes of the young, enthusiastic videographer I knew. They were eyes of ancient knowledge, of cosmic understanding, eyes that seemed to be filled with the secrets of the universe. And when she spoke, her voice was not hers. It was deep, resonant, and filled with an authority that was unnerving. It was the voice of the being, the voice that had been speaking through her. "The process is complete," she said, her voice echoing in the silent clearing. "The connection has been established. I am now one with the source," and in that moment, I knew that Sarah, as I knew her, was gone. She had become part of this alien consciousness, a vessel for something beyond human comprehension. The ground beneath my feet vibrated again, stronger now, and cracks appeared in the earth, as if the very mountain was about to split open. The plants were moving faster now, their red light pulsating, and the shadow was growing bigger, closer, almost engulfing us. I looked at Jacques, but he was gone. He had run, abandoning me to face this horror alone. And suddenly, I was alone, facing the unimaginable. My scientific beliefs had just shattered, My view of the world was completely changed, and I realized that whatever I had learned in my life was pointless. It meant nothing to that ancient being that was in front of me. I was just another observer of a cosmic event, and it was happening right here, in front of my eyes. I was left with an option. I could either run and save myself like Jacques, or stay and face the consequences of my decision. My rational mind was screaming for me to run, but my moral conscience was telling me to stay. I could not abandon Sarah, even if it meant facing death. And then it happened. I knew that this was not the end. This was just the beginning, and that I was about to start a journey into the unknown, and I was willing to take that path, even if it meant death. My breath hitched in my throat, a short, ragged gasp as the reality of the situation crashed over me like a tidal wave. Sarah, the vibrant, adventurous woman I had known, was gone. Her body was still there, floating amidst the pulsing, red-glowing vegetation, but it was merely a vessel, a puppet controlled by some ancient, malevolent entity. The weight of that realization was crushing, a cold, hard stone settling in the pit of my stomach. My hands trembled uncontrollably, and I could barely keep myself standing as the world around me seemed to shift, to twist, and to melt before my very eyes. The shadow above the vegetation continued to grow, solidifying into a formless, shifting mass that seemed to absorb the very light around it. The hum was now a deafening roar, a cacophony of sound that seemed to penetrate every cell in my body, vibrating in my very bones. The plants, now transformed, seemed to be reaching out to me, their thorn tendrils swaying as if beckoning me to join Sarah in her otherworldly trance. My mind raced, trying to process the impossible, trying to make sense of the horror that was unfolding before me. My first instinct was to run, to follow Jacques' example, and flee into the safety of the forest. But a strange sense of responsibility, a desperate need to protect Sarah, rooted me to the spot. I couldn't abandon her, not like this, not after everything we had been through. It was a reckless, illogical decision, I knew, but it was one that I couldn't seem to ignore. The idea of leaving her to the mercy of that entity was more terrifying than facing it myself. Even though she was not the same person I knew anymore, I tried to call out to her, to reach her through the veil of possession, but my voice was swallowed by the overwhelming hum. It was a futile attempt, I knew, but I couldn't help but try. My heart pounded in my chest as I took a step closer, my senses heightened to an almost unbearable degree. The stench of decaying vegetation was almost suffocating, and the very air seemed to crackle with an otherworldly energy. It felt as if I was stepping into another dimension, a realm of the bizarre, the terrifying, and the unknown. As I moved closer, I could see Sarah's face more clearly now. Her eyes were open, but they were devoid of any emotion, any humanity. They were like black pools of nothingness, cold and empty. And her smile, which before was bright and welcoming, was now a sinister, frozen rictus, a macabre reflection of the monstrous entity that controlled her. I reached out my hand towards her, wanting to touch her, to see if there was any trace of the woman I knew left inside that vessel. But as soon as my fingers were inches away from her skin, her body started to convulse, her head tilted back in an unnatural angle, and the deep, resonant voice echoed from her throat. "You cannot save her," the entity said, its voice a symphony of dissonant sounds. "She is one of us now. She has seen the truth, and she will never return." The words, though spoken through Sarah, seemed to seep into my mind, to plant themselves into my very core, and a cold sense of dread settled in my heart. I was nothing but an observer, nothing more than an ant facing a god, and whatever was happening, it was not going to be a kind process. The entity through Sarah's body then turned towards me, its gaze piercing my soul. "But you are not yet one of us," it said. You still have a choice. You can embrace the truth and join us, or you can choose to remain in your ignorance and be destroyed with the rest of your insignificant world. I felt an overwhelming sensation of powerlessness, of being trapped in a web of cosmic proportions. The words were a challenge, a choice between the unknown and the darkness. It was a moment where my beliefs were shattered, and where everything that I once thought was true was put in question. The vegetation seemed to react to the entity's words, their thorn tendrils tightening, reaching towards me, and the red glow intensifying, as if they were impatient for my answer. My mind was racing, trying to weigh the pros and cons of each possible decision, trying to rationalize the impossible. But I knew that there was no logical answer, no scientific explanation for what was happening. I was facing something that was beyond my comprehension, something that defied all the laws of nature. My world of logic and reason was collapsing around me, and I was facing the very real possibility of annihilation. I looked back at where Jacques had been, but the only trace that he had been there was a small fire and a small trail of footprints in the mud. I was now alone, facing the true nature of the horror, without any allies, with no hopes of survival. The mountain was silent, but the entity was screaming at me, beckoning me, pulling me. And in that moment, I was more scared than I had ever been in my entire life. The fear was no longer an emotion. It was a physical entity, an overpowering force that was threatening to swallow me whole. The entity's words hung in the air, a chilling ultimatum that echoed in my mind, challenging everything I believed in. It offered me a choice, a path to either join it, embracing an unknown truth, or to remain in my ignorance and face certain annihilation. My hands were still trembling. My heart was still pounding in my chest, but a new sensation was starting to take hold in my soul. It was not the fear that had been devouring me. It was a new kind of determination. I had to survive this. For a moment, I considered the entity's offer. It was a tempting prospect to understand the universe, to have the secrets of existence revealed to me, and to become one with something powerful. It was a chance to escape the mortal coil, to become something more. But as I looked at Sarah's empty eyes, at her frozen smile, I knew that I could never accept that path. I could never abandon my humanity, my sense of self, even if it meant facing my own destruction. I finally understood that the entity's promise of understanding was nothing more than a trap, a deceitful lure to ensnare me in its web. And accepting that path would mean losing myself completely. And then I had another realization. This was no longer about scientific discovery. This was not about rational exploration. This was now about a battle for survival. And I was going to fight. The entity sensed my internal conflict, and its voice, through Sarah, grew more forceful. "Do not resist," it said, its words like shards of glass piercing through my thoughts. "Join us and become part of something greater." The plants, sensing the change in my resolve, tightened their grip on the ground, and the thorns became longer and sharper, ready to pierce my skin. The red light of the patterns grew more intense, bathing the scene in an eerie glow. It was a battle of wills now, and I knew that my survival depended on my strength, not just physical, but also mental. It was then, looking at the plants, that I had an epiphany. I had been so focused on the geometric patterns, on the strange alien nature of the vegetation, that I had overlooked a crucial detail. These plants, as alien as they may seem, were still plants. They were still part of the ecosystem of this world. And if I could figure out how they worked, if I could find a weakness, I might have a chance of surviving. The scientist inside me, the rational thinker, was finally taking back control of my body, and this realization gave me the strength I needed. I focused my attention on the tendrils that were reaching towards me. They seemed to be moving in a very specific, rhythmic pattern, following some kind of invisible energy source. I remembered my botany studies, the structure of plants, the way they respond to light, to gravity, to water. I started to look for patterns, for anomalies. My scientific mind was finally working again, giving me the tools I needed to try and get through this. As I observed the tendrils, I noticed that they seemed to weaken when they were exposed to direct light. It was a small detail, but it was enough. I reached into my bag and pulled out my emergency flashlight, the one I always used for nighttime explorations. It was a small thing, but it was the only weapon I had against this terrifying entity. I activated the flashlight, and a beam of white light pierced through the red glow, hitting one of the tendrils directly. The plant recoiled, its movement faltering as it tried to avoid the beam. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. I had found the source of its strength, and I also had found its weakness. And for the first time since I had arrived to this cursed place, I had a glimpse of hope. I knew that the entity was not going to let me get away with that. I knew that I had to act fast. I had to use this weakness to my advantage, to buy myself some time, to try to escape this nightmare and maybe save Sarah in the process. The fear was still there, yes, but it was now mixed with a new sense of purpose, a new understanding of what I was doing. I wasn't just trying to survive. I was also trying to fight back, to face the darkness, and to reclaim my place in the world. And I was willing to fight for it, even if it meant facing death itself. In that moment, I finally understood that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to keep moving forward despite it. I was scared, yes, but I was not going to back down. I was ready to face whatever was to come, and I was going to do everything in my power to survive. I was going to use my knowledge, my determination, and my will to overcome this terrifying ordeal. I was no longer just a scientist. I was now a warrior fighting for his life, and for the life of his friend, and I was ready to do everything to win this impossible battle. My hand trembled as I gripped the flashlight, the beam cutting through the oppressive red glow of the vegetation. The plants recoiled from the light, their thorny tendrils twitching as if they were in pain. It was a small advantage, but it was enough to embolden me. I knew that I had to act quickly, that the entity wouldn't let me exploit this weakness for long. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the frantic rhythm of my heart, and prepared to face the impossible. The entity, through Sarah's vacant eyes, seemed to sense my renewed determination. Its voice, a deep, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very core of my being, echoed in the silent clearing. "You cannot win," it hissed, its words like icy shards piercing through the fog of my adrenaline-fueled mind. "You are nothing but a fleeting spark in the grand tapestry of existence. Your struggles are futile." But I was not listening anymore. My rational mind was focused on the task at hand. I was not going to surrender, not to this entity, not to this nightmare. I pointed the flashlight at the tendrils that were holding Sarah, creating a path towards her. The plants recoiled from the beam, their grip loosening. I took a step closer, feeling a surge of adrenaline coursing through my veins. I knew that the entity was growing more powerful, that time was running out, but I was not going to back down. I moved towards the center of the patterns, towards Sarah, towards my impossible goal. The challenge was immense. The odds were stacked against me, but I was ready to face them. My fear was still there, a constant companion, but it was no longer paralyzing me. It was, instead, fueling my resolve. As I drew closer to Sarah, I realized that the geometric patterns of the vegetation were not just random arrangements. They were, in fact, a network of conduits, a complex system that channeled the entity's power. And Sarah, with her body in the center of those patterns, had become the main point of connection, the focal point of the alien energy. If I could somehow disrupt that connection, if I could find a way to cut her free, then perhaps I could weaken the entity. Perhaps I could stand a chance against it. I shined the flashlight over all the patterns and noticed that each connection in each pattern was similar, and each one was connected by a smaller vine. It was an intricate connection, but the point of the system was the same. I was not just fighting the vegetation, I was also fighting the connection itself. And as I stared at the plants, a new idea started to form in my mind, a reckless idea. Yes, but my only option. If light was the weakness, then the system was the connection. But what if I could break that connection? What if I could destroy the pattern completely? I reached into my bag again, searching for something that could help me disrupt the pattern, something that was not organic, and my fingers grasped a small bottle that I had almost forgotten, the fuel for my portable stove. It was highly flammable, and I knew that if I poured it on the vegetation, it would be like a bomb, a powerful explosion. It was a desperate measure, yes, but I had no other option. I was ready to make the ultimate sacrifice. I carefully poured the fuel over the vegetation, making sure to cover as much ground as possible, and then, using the lighter of my flashlight, I ignited it. The fire erupted in a sudden, bright blaze, engulfing the plants in a wall of flames. It was a terrifying spectacle, the crackling of the fire, the smell of burning leaves, and the intense heat, creating a sense of chaos that was overwhelming. The red glow of the vegetation intensified, and the entity, through Sarah's body, let out a scream of pain, a guttural shriek that was unlike anything I had ever heard. The patterns were no longer a network of power. They were now an inferno. But then, something unexpected happened. The fire started to spread, not only through the vegetation, but also through the ground, as if the very earth was also part of the connection. And as the fire consumed the plants, and as the fire engulfed everything, I realized that I had not only weakened the entity, I had also made a mistake. The fire was spreading quickly, faster than I had anticipated, and I realized that I was about to become trapped in my own blaze. But it was also at this moment that I noticed the biggest and the most important detail. The true enemy was not the entity and the plants. The true enemy was the mountain itself. The fire roared, a ravenous inferno that consumed the vegetation, its flames licking at the sky as the mountain itself seemed to awaken in fury. The red glow intensified, bathing the scene in an apocalyptic light. The entity, through Sarah's possessed body, let out a scream that seemed to tear the very fabric of reality, a cacophony of pain and fury that sent shivers down my spine. I was no longer just fighting the alien consciousness that had possessed Sarah. I was now fighting the very essence of the mountain itself. The ground beneath me trembled violently, cracks appearing in the earth as the fire spread. The trees around me writhed and twisted, their branches reaching out like grasping claws, and I realized that the mountain was not just an inanimate object. It was a living, breathing entity, an ancient being that had been awakened from its slumber. And I was now at the center of its rage. I knew that I had made a terrible mistake. I had underestimated the power of the mountain, the scale of the entity's connection to this place. The fire, which I had hoped would be my salvation, had become a double-edged sword, a weapon that was threatening to consume me along with my enemies. But I had no time for regret. I had to act, I had to fight, and I had to survive. I moved towards Sarah, her body still floating in the center of the inferno, a macabre puppet amidst the flames. Her face was a mask of pain, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and understanding. I knew that, even though the entity was controlling her, there was still a part of her, a flicker of humanity, trapped inside that possessed shell. I had to reach her. I had to find that flicker, and I had to do everything I could to save her, even if it meant facing death. I grabbed a long, sturdy branch that had fallen from one of the burning trees and used it to push away the burning vegetation, creating a path to Sarah. The fire seemed to recoil from the branch, as if it had a will of its own. I pushed forward, moving through the flames, my clothes burning, my skin searing, but I didn't stop. I had come too far to give up now. As I reached Sarah, I could see that the entity was weakening, its grip on her body faltering. The red glow around her was dimming, and the hum was starting to subside. But the mountain, sensing the change, was growing more violent, more unpredictable. The ground was shaking more intensely, the trees were falling around me, and the sky was filled with the smoke and flames of the inferno. I grabbed Sarah, and her skin was cold and lifeless, like that of a corpse. I pulled her out from the center of the burning vegetation, and as soon as she was out of the pattern, she seemed to come back to herself. Her eyes opened, and she looked at me, not with the empty gaze of the entity, but with a look of recognition, a look of hope. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice weak but clear. "Thank you." And then the final twist. As soon as she spoke those words, the mountain seemed to realize that its connection to her had been broken, and in a final act of fury, it erupted. The earth split open, a massive chasm opening right in front of us, the flames reaching higher than ever before. I grabbed Sarah's hand and we both started to run, our bodies fueled by adrenaline, our will to survive a weapon against the madness. We ran towards the edge of the forest, pushing through the inferno, our lungs burning, our bodies screaming for us to stop. But we couldn't. We had come too far to give up now. As we reached the edge of the clearing, a massive tree fell right behind us, and we fell to the ground, our bodies exhausted, our minds reeling. I looked back at the burning mountain, the smoke reaching the sky, the flames still raging. The entity was silent now, its presence diminished, but I knew, deep down, that it was still there, dormant, waiting for the opportunity to return. And as I held Sarah in my arms, I realized that I had survived the impossible, but I had also changed forever. I had faced the darkness, and I had come out the other side, but I knew, deep down, that I was no longer the same man. The world was forever different, and I was no longer just a scientist. I was something else now. I had survived. Yes, but I knew that this was not the end. This was just the beginning of another kind of journey, a journey that I was not sure that I was ready to face. But I knew I had to. The world was waiting, and I was not going to hide. I knew the horror was not over, and I would always live with that weight. I had survived. But I knew that the mountain would always be a part of me now, and I wasn't sure if I had really left that place behind. The morning sun cast a pale light over the ravaged landscape, a stark contrast to the inferno that had raged just hours before. The mountain was still smoldering, smoke rising from the scorched earth, a testament to the cataclysm we had survived. Sarah and I were lying on the edge of the forest, our bodies battered and bruised, our minds reeling from the horrors we had witnessed. The weight of the experience pressed down on us, a heavy burden that we knew would never truly leave us. Sarah was silent, her eyes wide and haunted, a reflection of the terror that she had faced. The entity was gone, its power diminished, but its presence had left a mark on her soul, a wound that I knew would take a lifetime to heal. I knew that she was not the same woman I had met at the beginning of our expedition. She had been touched by the supernatural. She had glimpsed the unimaginable, and she had returned forever changed. The knowledge that she had been possessed by something so ancient and so powerful was something that I knew would haunt her for the rest of her life. As for me, I was a different man too. My scientific beliefs had been shattered, my understanding of the world irrevocably altered. I had faced the supernatural, and I had survived. But I had also seen the true face of evil, the true nature of the unknown, and I knew that there were forces at play in the universe that were far beyond human comprehension. My journey to Madagascar had not been just an expedition. It had been a descent into hell and back, and my sanity and soul was now forever scarred with what I had experienced there. Jacques was nowhere to be found. I never saw him again. Whether he had found his way to safety, or whether he had succumbed to the fear that had consumed him, I will never know. But his absence was another reminder of the price of this adventure, another testament to the destructive nature of the events that had unfolded. The memory of his fear, the look in his eyes, the desperation in his voice, is forever engraved in my mind. The world had changed for me, and I knew that my life would never be the same. My days of exploring the world with the wonder and innocence of a man who believed in logic and reason were over. From that point onward, I became a man who knows that there is something beyond the scope of science, that there are ancient forces hidden in this world, and that there are things that should remain undisturbed. I know that one day that ancient evil might rise again, and when it does, I will be ready to face it. I had gone to that mountain looking for the secrets of the world. What I found was much more than I had ever expected, and much more than I could have ever imagined. The long-term consequences of our actions were impossible to predict. Perhaps we had only delayed the inevitable. Perhaps we had unleashed something that we would never be able to control. But I knew that we had to try, that we could not remain silent in the face of such a terrifying threat. And I hoped that, one day, I would have the courage and the strength to face it again, and maybe try to do things right this time. But one thing was for sure, I would never be the same. I had seen things that no man should see, and it was a burden that I knew I would carry for the rest of my life. We eventually found our way back to civilization, battered, bruised, and broken. But we were alive, and that was all that mattered. Or at least, that was what we told ourselves to try and cope with the horrors that we had seen. Years have passed since that fateful expedition. Sarah and I rarely speak of what happened on that mountain, but I know that we both carry the scars of that experience. We live our lives, but I always catch Sarah looking at the sky, or in silence, as if waiting for something to happen. I sometimes wonder if the entity is still out there, waiting in the darkness, gathering its strength, preparing for its return. And I cannot help but wonder if the next time it returns, it will be the end of everything. Sometimes I still hear the hum in the dark, even if the mountain is now miles away. This story is a reflection of a nightmare that I lived, a glimpse into the darkness that exists beyond our understanding. The universe is full of mysteries that we can barely comprehend, but we cannot hide from them. We must face the unknown, even when we are filled with fear. Have you ever experienced something that you couldn't explain? Share your story in the comments below. And if you liked this story, click on the next video, which is another tale of the bizarre and the strange, and see what lurks in the darkness.